Marco Polo, the dreamweaver of the Silk Road. In the year 1254, in the enchanting lagoon city of Venice, where the sea whispered secrets to the stones and the scent of saffron and cinnamon lingered in the misty alleys, Marco Polo was born. Venice, a republic laced with canals and crowned with Byzantine domes, was not just a city but a crossroad of worlds. It pulsed with trade, intrigue, and the promise of the unknown. Marco was born into a family that didn't merely trade in spices and silks, they traded in adventure. His father, Niccolo Polo, and uncle, Mafio Polo, were among the few Europeans with the courage and resources to peer beyond the shroud of mystery that cloaked the East. These weren't armchair merchants. They were travelers of the highest order, men who packed their lives into caravans and sailed into the realm of myth and danger. While Marco was still in his cradle, the Polo brothers embarked on a perilous eastward journey that would take them across endless steppes, treacherous deserts, and through the high passes of mountains where even breath became precious. Their destination? The court of the most powerful man in the world, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. His empire was no less than the largest continuous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific to the gates of Europe, swallowing cities, cultures, and kingdoms in its wake. Yet Kublai Khan was not the savage warlord Westerners feared. He was elegant, intelligent, and deeply curious about the world beyond his grasp. When the Polo brothers arrived at his court, they were welcomed not with suspicion, but with reverence and fascination. They brought him gifts from the West, stories of distant lands, and perhaps more importantly, the intrigue of unfamiliar knowledge. Impressed, the Khan asked them to return to Europe with a request for the Pope, to send 100 wise men, scholars, and theologians, who could share with the Mongol court the philosophies, scientific principles, and spiritual tenets of Christianity. Years later, when the brothers returned to Venice, they discovered Marco, now a bright-eyed teenager, eager for the world, full of questions and restlessness. He was fluent in multiple languages, curious about maps and trade winds, and fascinated by tales of things unseen. The road was calling him, as if the spirit of discovery had passed through his blood like inheritance. In 1271, the three Polos, father, uncle, and son, set out on a voyage that would span continents and time, and that would make Marco a household name for centuries to come. They left from Acre, a city in present-day Israel, then threaded their way through Persia's golden deserts, braved the sheer cliffs and high valleys of the Hindu Kush, crossed the burning breath of the Taklamakan Desert, and scaled the snow-choked peaks of the Pamirs. This was no leisurely expedition. They faced political unrest, treacherous terrain, and illnesses with names they didn't yet understand. Yet through it all, Marco observed. He wrote, he remembered, he watched how rulers ruled and peasants prayed. He noted what fabrics they wore, what animals they bred, what spices they blended into their stews. He paid attention to the shapes of roofs, the customs of courtship, the layout of cities. What fascinated him most, perhaps, was how the Chinese used paper money, a revolutionary concept when Europe still dealt in silver coins and barter systems. He documented it with almost scientific precision. After 3 years of relentless travel, they reached Xanadu, also known as Xanadu, the Khan's fabled summer capital. It was a marvel of architecture and aesthetic wonder. Palaces with lacquered eaves that curled like dragons' tails, fountains carved of jade, gardens arranged in mathematical harmony, and halls filled with falcons, courtiers, and poets. It was here, in this jewel of a city, that Marco Polo was introduced to Kublai Khan. The emperor was captivated by Marco's youth, his linguistic skills, and his vibrant curiosity. Marco, in turn, found himself awestruck by the breadth of the Khan's vision and the complexity of his empire. He quickly learned the Mongol language and customs and was appointed as a court emissary, a trusted diplomat in a land of intrigue and ambition. For 17 years, Marco traveled through the heart of the empire on missions of diplomacy, observation, and cultural exchange. He journeyed across Mongolia's grasslands, through the bustle of Chinese megacities, the jungles of Burma, the mystic highlands of Tibet, and even as far as coastal India and the tropical reaches of Southeast Asia. He covered thousands of miles, encountering peoples and civilizations that no European had ever seen, nor would for centuries more. He described cities with populations that dwarfed European capitals, markets bursting with silk and jade, and ports so vast that hundreds of ships docked there daily. He marveled at Hangzhou, which he called Kinsei, the finest and most splendid city in the world. With over 1 million inhabitants, arched stone bridges, lotus ponds, paper lanterns glowing like stars, and a culture steeped in tea and poetry. He praised the Yam system, an imperial postal network more efficient than anything imagined in the West. Using relay stations with fresh horses and riders, the Mongols could deliver messages across thousands of miles with astonishing speed. Marco compared it to a lightning-fast ancient FedEx, only manned by warriors with bows and satchels of secrets. Yet Marco's tales were not always grounded. He described rhinoceroses as unicorns, recounted rivers infested with crocodiles that shimmered like dragons, and told of diamonds guarded by snakes that could only be lured away with raw meat. His stories danced between myth and reality, but even when they wandered into fantasy, they retained the texture of wonder and sincerity. Eventually, as age caught up with Kublai Khan and the glamour of court life waned, the Polos longed for home. But leaving the Khan's service was no simple affair. He had grown fond of them, especially Marco, and was reluctant to part with his Venetian emissaries. Sensing that his time was passing and perhaps moved by duty or generosity, he finally granted them permission to leave on one condition: that they escort a Mongol princess to Persia, where she was to marry a noble prince. So the Polos joined a fleet of 14 grand ships, setting sail from the bustling port of Ziton, known today as Chuanjo. They journeyed across storm-swept waters, past the islands of Sumatra, into the Indian Ocean, and finally reached the Persian Gulf. It was a voyage marked by disaster. Storms battered the sails, pirates shadowed their route, and illness decimated their ranks. Of the several hundred passengers and crew, only 18 survived. From Persia, the Polos traveled overland through war-weary cities, across dust-choked roads and into the familiar chaos of Constantinople, before arriving in Venice in 1295. They were clad in silks, laden with jade and spices, and so transformed by their travels that many Venetians did not recognize them. Some thought they were frauds. Others whispered of sorcery. The Polos, unbothered, simply unveiled their treasures and began to speak of marvels. Soon after, Marco was captured by Genoese forces in a naval skirmish. Imprisoned, he met Rustichello de Pisa, a romance writer with a flair for drama. Together, they began to write. The result? Il Milione, The Travels of Marco Polo, a book that would redefine the West's imagination of the East. It spread like wildfire across Europe, translated into Latin, French, German, and Italian. It offered something few had seen: a vivid portrait of Asia not as a mythic realm, but as a living, breathing world of intelligence, innovation, and beauty. Many doubted his stories. Others devoured them. One young dreamer named Christopher Columbus would later carry a dog-eared copy of the book as he sailed westward, chasing a world Marco had once described. Marco never returned to Asia. He remained in Venice, married, fathered children, and grew wealthy as a merchant. When he died in 1324, he left behind not only gold, but a lens through which the world would be seen anew. Though scholars debated his accounts for centuries, suspecting exaggeration or second-hand stories, modern research has verified much of what he described. The grandeur of Chinese cities, the efficiency of Mongol governance, the delicacies of Persian trade, and the rich textures of Eastern culture. On his deathbed, when asked if all he said was true, he reportedly replied, "I have not told half of what I saw. Perhaps it was humility, or perhaps it was the haunting realization that the world was too vast to ever fully capture." Because Marco Polo wasn't merely a traveler or a trader. He was a storyteller, a bridge between continents, a young Venetian who looked beyond the horizon and dared to dream in full color. He showed Europe not only what lay in the East, but how to look at it with wonder, not fear. So now, dear dreamer, as your eyes close and your breath softens, picture Marco beneath a jade roof in a palace lit by lanterns. Imagine the hush of snow over Mongol tents, the hum of markets in Hangzhou, the crackle of fire as he leans forward and begins, in that lilting Venetian voice. Let me tell you of a land beyond the desert, where pearls are as plentiful as pebbles and emperors ride with thunder at their heels. Good night, my fellow explorer. May your dreams carry you far, to lands where stories bloom, and may you always wake with wonder in your heart. Ibn Battuta, the man who outran the world. Once upon a time, under the golden sun of a world stitched together by trade, scrolls, and stars, a boy named Ibn Battuta was born. The year was 1304, the place, Tangier, Morocco, where the salty wind whispered through clay alleys and the call to prayer rose above the ocean's breath. Ibn Battuta was born into a respected family of Islamic legal scholars. His life, by all reasonable accounts, was meant to follow the quiet rhythm of study and sermon. A career as a qadi, a judge in Islamic law, was not just expected, it was practically guaranteed. But deep within the young boy stirred something more ancient than logic, more potent than books. He was born with wanderlust in his bones. As a child, he would sit by the harbor, watching ships vanish over the horizon, imagining the lands they would reach, the languages they'd speak, the spices they'd carry, the stories they'd bring home. The longing to follow them grew stronger with each passing year. So, at the tender age of 21, in the year 1325, Ibn Battuta did something utterly irrational by the standards of his time. He packed what little he owned, mounted a camel and left Morocco, alone, without maps, guides, or guarantees. His goal was to complete the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. His parents wept as he departed. He promised to return in a year. He would not come back for 24. His journey began across the rugged landscapes of North Africa, through the sunburnt kingdoms of modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. The deserts stretched endlessly, vast as oceans. He faced scorching heat, sandstorms, illnesses, and thieves. But his spirit only grew hungrier. In Cairo, he marveled at the mighty mosques and ancient tombs of the Mamluk Sultanate. He walked through streets dense with scholars, poets, merchants, and craftsmen. He wandered through libraries and watched students debate philosophy under palm trees. The city was a marvel of architecture and intellect, a crossroads of Africa and the Middle East. And yet, for Ibn Battuta, it was only the beginning. Instead of heading directly to Mecca, he took the long, scenic route, because of course he did. He journeyed through Palestine, praying in Jerusalem. He explored Syria, stood beneath the great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and wandered through Baghdad's fading grandeur. Everywhere he went, he met strangers who became friends, slept beneath unfamiliar skies, and carried his faith like a compass guiding him across unknown lands. Eventually, he reached Mecca, his original goal. He fulfilled the pilgrimage he'd set out for. But something within him had shifted. He wasn't simply a pilgrim anymore. He had become something else, something older, almost primal. He was a traveler now, a seeker of places and people, stories and sensations. So, like any reasonable 14th century man with zero modern conveniences, he kept going. What followed was one of the most astonishing journeys in all of recorded history. Over the course of 24 years, Ibn Battuta would travel more than 120,000 kilometers, over 75,000 miles, through what are now over 40 modern countries. No map could contain what he would see. He crossed 3 continents, survived wars, shipwrecks, and political revolutions, met kings and beggars, scholars and pirates, and documented a world so vast and interconnected that it would put even modern globetrotters to shame. He began with the Arabian Peninsula, circling back through Yemen and Oman, tasting dates on dusty roads and listening to the Quran chanted beneath desert stars. He sailed the East African coast, visiting Somalia, Zanzibar, and as far south as present-day Tanzania. He traded stories with sultans, walked along coral-walled cities, admired mosques carved from stone, and watched merchants haggle in markets filled with ivory, gold, and frankincense. In Kilwa, a Swahili port city, he witnessed a rich blend of African, Arab, and Persian culture, proof that the Indian Ocean was not a barrier but a silk thread binding civilizations. Then came India. Arriving in Delhi, he found himself in the heart of the mighty Sultanate, where Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq ruled with both brilliance and brutal volatility. The Sultan, impressed by Ibn Battuta's learning and legal expertise, appointed him as a qadi, a judge with lavish pay and a palace to live in. It was the dream job, at least on paper. The reality was more complex. The Sultan was wildly unpredictable, capable of great generosity one moment and ruthless punishment the next. Ibn Battuta lived in luxury, married multiple times, and navigated the tangled web of court politics. But eventually, court life grew dangerous. Whispers of intrigue and execution filled the halls. When offered the chance to serve as ambassador to China, Ibn Battuta accepted not just to serve, but to escape. His path to China was anything but direct. First, he traveled to the Maldives, where, true to form, he somehow became chief judge of the islands. The Maldives were unlike anything he'd seen. Lush, isolated, and governed by women who, to his initial shock and later amusement, dressed with far more boldness than his conservative sensibilities preferred. He married again, criticized the court's decorum, and documented the intricate laws of the islanders. But soon, politics grew tiresome. He left, narrowly escaping by boat. The journey continued through Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and eventually to the glittering coast of China. Historians debate exactly how far north he traveled, but his descriptions of cities like Hangzhou, which he called Kansai, match historical details with uncanny precision. He noted the widespread use of paper money, the disciplined rituals of Confucian temples, the elaborate process of porcelain production, and the mathematical layout of Chinese cities. He was awestruck by their organization, their sanitation, and their infrastructure, especially the incredible Grand Canal, which moved people and goods with effortless grace. On his return journey westward, as if determined to explore every edge of the earth, Ibn Battuta traveled through Central Asia, visiting the Golden Horde in modern-day Russia. He met Mongol princes, broke bread with warriors, and saw firsthand how Islam had threaded its way into far-flung corners of the steppes. What amazed him most was how people of vastly different ethnicities, customs, and languages could all kneel in the same direction for prayer, read the same holy text, and follow the same call to unity. It was a global faith, stitched into the bones of disparate cultures, and he was its witness. Eventually, though eventually hardly does justice to the decades he spent abroad, he returned to Morocco. It was 1349. He had been away for nearly 24 years. He had outlived his parents, lost wives, gained children he would never meet again, and returned to a homeland that had changed as much as he had. But the road had become part of him. He couldn't sit still. He left again, this time westward to Al-Andalus, modern-day Spain. He explored Granada's golden palaces and marveled at the meeting of Muslim and European art, science, and architecture. From there, he traveled south across the Sahara to the flourishing Mali Empire in West Africa. In Mali, under the successors of the great Mansa Musa, he visited Timbuktu, a city famed for its libraries, scholars, and rivers of gold. He admired its markets, listened to griots sing the histories of kings, and saw with his own eyes that the wealth and sophistication of black African kingdoms rivaled anything in the East or the Mediterranean. By 1354, Ibn Battuta had returned to Morocco for the final time. He had seen more of the known world than any person in history before or since. His travels spanned North Africa, the Middle East, East Africa, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and possibly even the islands of the Pacific. He crossed mountains, deserts, seas, and centuries of belief. Recognizing the value of his experience, the Sultan of Morocco commissioned a young scholar, Ibn Juzay, to document his journey. The result was the Rihla, or the Journey, a book that reads like an epic. It is more than a travelogue. It is a living, breathing kaleidoscope of the 14th century world. It includes legal observations, cultural clashes, food reviews, philosophical debates, romantic detours, and even some eyebrow-raising critiques of local fashion and etiquette. Ibn Battuta was not a passive observer. He was cheeky, opinionated, devout, curious, and sometimes exasperated. He judged and admired, questioned and documented, and in doing so, he left behind not an empire of land, but an empire of knowledge. He gave future historians a map of the medieval world drawn by someone who walked it, not to conquer it, but to understand it. He likely died around 1368 in Morocco with no ships named after him, no statues erected, and no territories bearing his name. And yet, his legacy is incalculable. In an age before passports, planes, or even the printing press, he had created something miraculous, a truly global perspective. So now, as your eyes flutter closed and the hush of sleep rises, imagine Ibn Battuta striding across the dunes beneath a starlit sky, a camel by his side, a worn leather journal clutched in his hand. In it, not just directions or distances, but memories, thousands of them, etched into paper like constellations. Imagine caravan bells jingling through desert silence, the heady scent of incense in a Delhi market, the wind brushing his beard in the Himalayas, the shimmer of Chinese lanterns reflected in black canal water. Let him guide your dreams tonight, not just to distant lands, but to deeper understanding, of faith, of people, of wonder. For in the end, Ibn Battuta was not just a traveler of space, but of spirit. Good night, my bold wanderer. May your dreams be long, your path endless, and your heart ever pulled toward the horizon. Christopher Columbus, the dreamer who sailed west. Once upon a tide, in a sun-baked corner of Italy's western coast, a boy was born in the bustling seaport of Genoa around the year 1451. His name? Cristoforo Colombo, known to the world as Christopher Columbus. He was the son of a wool weaver, a boy not destined for palaces or politics, but from a young age, he was different. While others saw the sea as a means of livelihood, Columbus saw it as a portal. He would stand at the edge of the harbor, watching sails disappear into the horizon, his blue eyes filled with wonder. While his hands helped with dye and thread, his mind was stitching dreams far beyond the limits of cloth. He was tall, fair-skinned, with piercing eyes and a shock of reddish hair that would fade to white with age. Even as a youth, he carried himself with the intense conviction of a man who believed he was meant for something greater. And perhaps, in a strange and chaotic way, he was right. Columbus began his life at sea early, sailing on merchant vessels through the Mediterranean and beyond. By the time he was in his 20s, he had ventured to Portugal, England, even the coast of West Africa. He studied maps obsessively, scribbled notes in the margins of travelogues, and listened intently to Arab and Jewish sailors who spoke of distant islands and uncharted waters. He soaked in knowledge like sponge soaks in salt water, thirsty, unrelenting. By the 1480s, Columbus became fixated on a single, audacious idea. What if one could reach the riches of Asia, its silks, its spices, its golden cities, not by heading east over land or around Africa, but by sailing directly west across the vast Atlantic Ocean? Most scholars of the time already accepted that the Earth was round, but they also understood it was far, far larger than Columbus estimated. He believed Asia was just a few weeks' voyage away. He was wrong off by thousands of miles. What he didn't know, and what no European had fully grasped, was that two entire continents lay between Europe and Asia. But Columbus was not a man easily swayed by facts. He was driven by belief, unyielding, absolute. He took his plan to monarch after monarch, Portugal, England, France. Rejections piled like storm clouds. Too dangerous, they said. Too expensive. Too foolish. But Columbus, undeterred, kept sailing forward on sheer force of will. Finally, in 1492, he found royal ears ready to listen. Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon had just concluded their conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. Flush with triumph and hungry for glory, they agreed to back Columbus's venture. It was a perfect storm of ambition, timing, and persuasive promise. Columbus offered them gold, converts to Christianity, and new trade routes to rival the wealth of the East. In return, they granted him ships, titles, and the promise of governance over any lands he might discover. And so, on August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He commanded about 90 men, a crew filled with sailors, adventurers, and skeptics. The journey across the Atlantic was longer and more harrowing than expected. The crew grew restless. Supplies dwindled. Rumors of mutiny began to bubble. To keep morale from sinking, Columbus began recording false distances in his logbooks, shortening the numbers to suggest they were closer to land than they truly were. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana spotted land from the deck of the Pinta. "Tierra, tierra," he cried. The crew erupted in celebration. They had reached land. But it wasn't Asia. It wasn't India. It was one of the islands of the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. Believing he had found islands off the coast of Asia, he referred to the native people he encountered as Indians, a misnomer that would endure tragically for centuries. He met the Taino people, who were generous, curious, and unsuspecting. Columbus saw them not just as inhabitants of a new world, but as potential subjects, potential converts, and sadly, potential laborers. His writings from those first encounters are filled with both admiration and condescension. He marveled at their hospitality while already imagining how easily they could be made to serve. Columbus made 3 more voyages across the Atlantic in the years that followed. He explored parts of Cuba, Hispaniola, modern Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the northern coast of South America. Each journey brought new discoveries and escalating tension. He remained convinced he was on the fringes of Asia, never admitting he had stumbled upon a completely new hemisphere. But dear dreamer, this is where the tide begins to turn. Columbus was not merely an explorer. He was also a colonial administrator, and not a particularly skilled or just one. His governance of Hispaniola was marked by brutality, mismanagement, and cruelty. The Spanish settlers grew resentful. The indigenous populations, subjected to forced labor, violence, and disease, began to suffer catastrophic losses. Entire communities were decimated. When Columbus returned for his second voyage, it wasn't with 3 small ships, it was with 17 vessels and over 1,000 men. His mission had evolved from exploration to colonization. Settlements were established. Resistance was met with steel and fire. Indigenous cultures were uprooted. The paradise he had discovered became a battleground for control. Eventually, the crown itself grew concerned. Reports of chaos and abuse reached Spain. In 1500, Columbus was arrested, returned to Spain in chains, and temporarily stripped of his titles. Though later pardoned, he would never regain full trust or power. He undertook one final voyage, still dreaming of gold and rivers leading to Asia. He explored the coasts of Central America, braving storms and illnesses, but found no passage and little glory. Columbus died in 1506, still believing he had reached the edge of Asia. He never knew that he had been the bridge between 2 worlds long divided by ocean and time. His voyages marked the beginning of a new era, an era of global connection, but also of conquest, disease, slavery, and cultural erasure. For centuries, Columbus was celebrated as the discoverer of the New World. Statues were erected, cities named, holidays dedicated. But over time, his legacy has been reevaluated. We now understand that while he opened the doors of exploration for Europe, he also helped unleash devastating waves of colonization upon indigenous peoples who had lived in the Americas for thousands of years. He was not the first to reach the Americas. Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had made landfall in North America centuries earlier. And of course, the indigenous peoples had always been there, nations with their own languages, cosmologies, and civilizations. Columbus, in truth, was neither saint nor demon. He was a man of his time, bold, flawed, ambitious, and deeply complex. His vision reshaped the globe. His ambition rewrote the maps. But the consequences of his actions echo through history, echoes that include triumph, tragedy, and enduring controversy. So now, dear dreamer, as you drift towards sleep, picture Columbus aboard the Santa Maria, sails stretched like wings, the ocean a vast mirror beneath the stars. Picture the excitement in his eyes as land breaks the horizon. Imagine the cheers of the crew, the crashing of waves, the moment the world changed forever. But also imagine the silence before those cheers. The people already living on those islands. The songs they sang. The stories they told. The lives they lived, unaware that a new era filled with both wonder and woe was about to land on their shores. Good night, sweet explorer of complicated truths. May your dreams sail past borders, question old maps, and always seek not only discovery but understanding. Amerigo Vespucci, the man who named a world. Let us drift now, dear dreamer, back to the heart of the 15th century. a time of rebirth of marble palaces and golden scrolls, a time when stars were being charted and human ambition, like the sails of caravels, billowed with daring. In the radiant city of Florence, where ideas bloomed like frescoes and the scent of ink mingled with the clink of wine glasses, Amerigo Vespucci was born in 1454. He did not arrive in the world with the swagger of a conqueror or the hunger of a fortune seeker. Instead, he was born into a well-off merchant family, surrounded not by swords but by parchment, books, and conversation. Florence was not a port city, it was a city of thought, and Amerigo, from an early age, found himself more entranced by astronomy charts than cannon fire, more excited by Latin and logic than by maps of treasure. His education was rigorous, shaped by the spirit of the Renaissance. He studied mathematics, cosmography, cartography, Latin, and classical philosophy. He learned to read the heavens like scripture and calculate time with precision. He became a thinker, one of those rare minds who looked not at what was, but at what could be. In his early career, Amerigo worked under Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, a cousin of the famous Lorenzo the Magnificent. The Medici family were not merely bankers. They were patrons of genius, orchestrators of exploration, and architects of an era. Under their guidance, Amerigo moved to Seville, Spain, around 1492, the very year Columbus returned from his first fateful voyage across the Atlantic. Seville was ablaze with excitement. Spanish ports thrummed with sailors' tales of strange islands, golden cities, and creatures never seen before. The docks echoed with the sound of hammering shipwrights and merchants arguing over silk and cinnamon. Amid this fervor, Amerigo Vespucci found his curiosity flaring like a comet. First, his role was modest. He helped outfit ships, organize cargo, examine logs. But gradually, watching others set sail wasn't enough. The maps were changing. The very shape of the world was bending. And Vespucci, the meticulous map reader, couldn't resist the pull. Between 1497 and 1504, Amerigo is believed to have taken part in multiple voyages to the lands across the Atlantic. Historians still debate the details, especially of the earliest expeditions, but what remains undeniable is that he traveled far along the coast of South America. He visited what we now know as Brazil, Venezuela, and possibly the mouth of the Amazon River. And unlike Columbus, who clung to the idea he had found the edges of Asia, Vespucci began to suspect something radical, something world-shattering. The stars were wrong. The coastline stretched too long, the landscapes too unfamiliar. The flora and fauna, the people and weather, all of it spoke of a land not at the fringes of India, but of a place entirely new. Amerigo began to record his findings meticulously. In his letters and accounts, most notably Mundus Novus, New World, he laid out a bold theory. This wasn't Asia at all. This was a new continent. He wrote with both wonder and precision. He described the southern constellations invisible from Europe, including the Southern Cross. He documented ocean currents, wind patterns, and the behavior of tides. He noted the changing length of shadows and the way the sky itself seemed altered by his movement across the globe. To Vespucci, the Earth was a grand, intricate system, and he was unraveling its design one measurement at a time. And then there were the people. Vespucci wrote of the indigenous societies he encountered with a blend of fascination, admiration, and, occasionally, the flawed lens of his time. He described their social customs, their dwellings, their spiritual beliefs. Some he found noble, others he judged harshly, but always he paid attention. He observed, he asked, he listened. He documented these cultures not as faceless obstacles to be conquered, but as distinct civilizations worthy of study, even if filtered through his European worldview. His writings captivated Europe. His letters were passed from court to university to monastery. They were translated into Latin, French, German, and Italian. Suddenly, a new narrative began to take shape. The world wasn't just expanding, it was transforming. Then, in 1507, came the moment that would etch his name into every schoolchild's atlas. In the quiet town of Saint Didivoje in Lorraine, a group of scholars and mapmakers, led by Martin Waldseemüller, began to create a new map of the world. Inspired by Vespucci's vivid accounts, they labeled the newly charted southern continent America in his honor. In a bold stroke of ink, they stated, "We see no reason why anyone should justly object to calling this part America, after Amerigo, its discoverer." It was a quiet revolution, and it stuck. Even though Vespucci had not been the first European to reach the New World, and even though he had never claimed to discover it, he had been the first to recognize it for what it was, a distinct landmass separate from Asia. That insight, grounded in scientific observation and careful reasoning, changed everything. By 1508, Vespucci was appointed Pilot Major of Spain, a post of enormous prestige. He was responsible for training new navigators, standardizing routes, and refining the very art of exploration. He turned his attention to preparing others for the seas, teaching a generation how to read the stars, measure latitude, and imagine beyond what was known. He died in Seville in 1512, quietly, without parades or monuments. But his influence did not fade. It deepened, rooting itself into the very fabric of how we understand geography, exploration, and identity. Amerigo Vespucci was not a conquistador. He didn't plant flags or seize cities. He did something perhaps more profound. He redefined the world through thought. His genius wasn't in dominion, but in perception. In daring to say, "This isn't a corner of something old. It is the beginning of something entirely new." And so, dear dreamer, as you prepare to sail into your own night of wonder, picture Vespucci aboard a wooden ship, the wind tugging at his cloak, the Southern Cross shimmering above. Imagine him leaning over a parchment map by lantern light, sketching coastlines no one had yet named, noting the stars that refused to match any known chart. Let your dreams tonight drift with him, not with swords or trumpets, but with questions and awe, because sometimes the most powerful discoveries aren't the ones that conquer land, but the ones that open minds. Good night, my cosmic cartographer. May your dreams be shaped by stars, guided by questions, and always drawn toward places yet to be named. Vasco da Gama, the admiral of spices and storms. Once upon a wind-whipped coast, in the sleepy Portuguese town of Sines around the year 1460, a boy was born who would one day draw the sea like a blade and carve a new path across the world. His name was Vasco da Gama, and though his beginnings were modest, a minor noble family, a house close to the sea, his destiny would rise with the tide. His father, Estevão da Gama, was a knight and a commander in the Order of Santiago, one of many religious military orders that dotted Portugal's landscape during its age of ambition. Stories of faraway lands, of gold-dusted deserts and spiced winds from the east, filled Vasco's childhood like lullabies. Portugal, at the western edge of Europe, was a nation dreaming eastward. And Vasco, sharp-eyed and stubborn, would become the instrument of that dream. This was an era of maps still filled with monsters, where the known world bled into the imagined. Under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, long deceased but deeply influential Portuguese explorers had been sailing steadily along the western coast of Africa, seeking a maritime path to India, the land of unimaginable wealth. Silks, rubies, and spices that perfumed entire empires. Why India? Why the sea? Because the overland trade routes, those ancient arteries that carried goods from Asia to Europe, were treacherous, slow, and increasingly controlled by rival empires, particularly the Ottomans. The idea of bypassing them entirely, of reaching India by circling Africa and claiming a direct route for Portugal, was a vision as bold as it was dangerous. In 1497, King Manuel I, driven by equal parts faith and fortune, selected Vasco da Gama to lead the most daring expedition Portugal had ever launched, a sea voyage to India. He was given command of 4 ships, the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, a supply vessel, and a nimble caravel, and set sail on July 8, 1497, from Lisbon. They followed the route pioneered by earlier explorers, notably Bartholomew Dias, who had reached the storm-scarred Cape of Good Hope nearly a decade earlier. But this time, da Gama was not turning back. His fleet pushed into the open Atlantic, skirting dangerous currents and avoiding hostile coasts. For months, they braved hunger, illness, and isolation. The sea was a brutal teacher, its lessons written in salt, blood, and wind. After battling the turbulent waters of the southern Atlantic, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and began sailing up Africa's eastern coast. They stopped at ports like Mozambique and Mombasa, thriving, Muslim-ruled cities that had long been part of the Indian Ocean's rich trade network. These cities, cosmopolitan and confident, looked at the Portuguese not as noble explorers, but as curious and somewhat arrogant newcomers. Da Gama expected warmth and welcome. What he encountered was suspicion. Diplomacy faltered. His lack of understanding of Islamic culture and the established political networks made interactions tense, and at times dangerous. In Mombasa, the Portuguese were nearly run out of the harbor. But in Malindi, farther north, fate shifted. There, Vasco met an unnamed pilot, likely an Arab or Indian sailor familiar with the monsoon winds. This man, whose name is lost to history, but whose knowledge was priceless, guided da Gama's ships across the vast Indian Ocean. They sailed with the wind's breath at their backs, and after 23 days at sea, in May of 1498, they reached the city of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India, modern-day Kozhikode. Vasco da Gama had done it. He had bridged continents by sea. Europe had finally reached the riches of the East, not through silk roads or camel caravans, but across the open ocean. But arrival did not mean acceptance. Calicut was no sleepy port. It was a sprawling, sophisticated hub of trade, culture, and power. Its ruler, the Zamorin, oversaw a vast and bustling economy. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and even China filled the markets with spices, jewels, silk, and pearls. And when da Gama arrived bearing gifts, trinkets, cloth, brass items, and hats, he was met not with awe but polite indifference. To the Portuguese, these offerings seemed exotic. To the Indians, they were unimpressive. Where were the silks? The gems? The gold? Da Gama's crew faced resentment from local Muslim traders, who saw them as rivals, not guests. Tensions mounted. Though da Gama managed to load some spices onto his ships, the encounter had made clear diplomacy in the East would not be simple. Still, the mission had succeeded. Vasco had found India and returned to Portugal in 1499 with ships heavy with pepper and tales that sounded like myth. The king welcomed him with celebrations, titles, wealth, and fame. He was a hero. The gateway to empire had been opened. But Da Gama's story didn't end with exploration. He would return to India, and not with hopeful hands. In 1502, just a few years after his triumphant return, Vasco da Gama led a second expedition, this time with 20 heavily armed warships. The message was no longer discovery. It was dominance. He was instructed to break Muslim control of the Indian Ocean trade and establish Portuguese power by force if necessary. And force he used. On this second voyage, Da Gama showed a cold and brutal efficiency. He blockaded ports, seized ships, and executed sailors. In one of the darkest episodes of his journey, he captured a vessel full of Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca, over 300 men, women, and children, and set it ablaze with them aboard. This was not the Vasco da Gama of statues and paintings. This was the admiral of cannons, of vengeance, of empire. He returned to Portugal again in 1503, laden with riches and fearsome reputation. The Portuguese crown wasted no time in establishing fortified outposts along the Indian coast. Goa would eventually become the crown jewel of their empire in Asia. Da Gama's voyages had changed everything. The Indian Ocean, once ruled by Arab, Indian, and East African fleets, now echoed with the sound of European warships. After his second voyage, Da Gama stepped away from the sea. For nearly 2 decades, he remained in Portugal, living a life of prestige and power. But the empire he helped create grew chaotic. Corruption spread. Local resistance hardened. Trade faltered. The Portuguese stronghold in India began to crack. In 1524, at nearly 65 years old, Vasco da Gama was called out of retirement by King John III and sent back to India, not as an explorer, but as the viceroy, the king's voice in the East. He was to restore order, stamp out corruption, and secure Portuguese control. He barely had time. Within months of his arrival in Cochin, Da Gama fell ill. Some say it was overwork, others a tropical disease. On Christmas Eve, 1524, Vasco da Gama died far from the cliffs of Portugal. His body would eventually be returned home, where he was buried with honors. Not as a sailor, but as a statesman, a national icon. And yet, history remembers him in 2 halves. To some, Vasco da Gama was a hero, a visionary who cracked the maritime code of the world, who connected East and West with sails and courage. To others, he was the harbinger of colonial violence, a man whose ambition set into motion centuries of exploitation, war, and cultural destruction. Both are true. His voyages reshaped the globe. They ignited the age of global trade. They made Portugal, for a moment in history, the most powerful empire on earth. But they also brought cannon fire to peaceful shores and turned trade into conquest. So now, dear dreamer, as you close your eyes and listen to the imaginary creak of wooden decks beneath your pillow, picture Vasco da Gama standing at the bow of his ship. Picture the salt on his skin, the stars overhead, the wide, black ocean ahead. Imagine him not as a myth, but as a man. Flawed, brilliant, driven, and forever caught between discovery and domination. Good night, my storm-chasing sailor. May your dreams be vast as oceans, bold as caravels, and wise enough to ask not just where you go, but what you leave behind. Ferdinand Magellan, the man who chased the edge of the world. Close your eyes and imagine the edge of a map, the jagged corner where dragons sleep and oceans fall off into the unknown. Now imagine a man who dared to step beyond it. His name was Ferdinand Magellan, and he was born around 1480 in northern Portugal, in a small village called Sabrosa. His early life was shaped not by calm or comfort, but by a kingdom obsessed with sea winds and starlight. Magellan's family had noble blood but little power. After his parents died when he was still a boy, he was sent to Lisbon to serve as a page at the royal court. There, amidst the polished marble halls and incense-scented chapels, he listened to captains, mathematicians, and mapmakers discuss the sea like it was a living god. Portugal was exploding outward around Africa into India, across the islands of Southeast Asia. And Ferdinand, quiet but fiercely intelligent, absorbed it all. He studied astronomy, navigation, and the art of reading wind and current. By his mid-20s, Magellan joined fleets headed for the east. He served with valor in Portuguese India, survived shipwrecks, battles, and political intrigue. He fought in Malacca, modern-day Malaysia, where the Portuguese captured one of the wealthiest ports in Asia. He saw with his own eyes the glittering spice markets of the East. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, each more valuable than gold back in Europe. But he also saw betrayal. Despite years of loyal service, Magellan fell out of favor with the Portuguese crown. His requests for promotion were denied, his motives questioned. Wounded in both body and pride, he did the unthinkable. He renounced his loyalty to Portugal and offered his services to Spain, their greatest rival. At the time, Spain had fallen behind in the global race for spices. Portugal had claimed the eastern route around Africa, and under the Treaty of Tordesillas, the world had been neatly split between the two powers, Portugal in the east, Spain in the west. But no one knew how far west one would have to sail to reach the east again. Magellan had an idea. He proposed a westward voyage to reach the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, by sailing not around Africa, but across the Atlantic, then through South America into an ocean no European had ever crossed. The Spanish crown, hungry for glory and profit, agreed. On September 20th, 1519, 5 ships set sail from Seville under the Castilian flag. The Trinidad, his flagship, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. The fleet carried over 270 men, hailing from different corners of Europe: Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, Frenchmen, even North Africans. Many couldn't speak the same language. Some couldn't read, but all were bound by the same gamble: to sail beyond certainty. Magellan's fleet crossed the Atlantic, enduring storms and dwindling supplies. They reached the coast of South America and followed it south, searching desperately for a passage, a secret gate to the other side of the world. Winter fell. The men froze. One ship wrecked. Another mutinied. Magellan quelled the rebellion with brutal efficiency, executing ringleaders and restoring order with iron authority. Finally, in October 1520, they found it. A narrow, winding, treacherous strait near the southern tip of the continent. It twisted through glaciers and mountains, with sudden currents and ghostly mists. Magellan's men, awestruck, whispered prayers with each mile. Today, we call it the Strait of Magellan. When they emerged weeks later into a vast, calm sea, Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, the Pacific Ocean, because of its peaceful appearance. But it was a cruel irony. What followed was a nightmare of endurance. The crossing of the Pacific took more than 3 months. They had no idea how vast it was. Their food ran out. They ate sawdust, rats, and the leather off the rigging. Fresh water became a fantasy. Disease spread. Sailors collapsed beside cannons and never rose again. Out of desperation, they turned to prayers, superstition, and even considered cannibalism. But they kept sailing. Eventually, they reached the islands of Guam, then the Philippines. There, for the first time in over a year, they tasted fresh fruit, met welcoming islanders, and felt soil beneath their boots. Magellan, devout and convinced of his mission, saw an opportunity, not only to claim land for Spain but to convert souls for Christendom. He formed alliances with local rulers, baptized hundreds, and became entangled in tribal politics. He overstepped. In April 1521, on the island of Mactan, Magellan led an attack against a local chieftain named Lapu-Lapu, who had refused conversion. It was a disaster. Magellan waded ashore with 40 men against hundreds. He was struck by a poisoned spear, then hacked down. He died in the surf, far from home, with the Spice Islands still a dream away. Yet his story did not end there. The remaining crew, ravaged by disease, starvation, and grief, pressed on. Under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, the survivors made it to the Spice Islands, loaded their remaining ships with cloves, and began the long journey home. Only one ship, the Victoria, made it back to Spain on September 6, 1522, almost 3 years after departure. Of the original 270 men, only 18 survived. They had completed something no one in history had ever done. They had circumnavigated the globe. They proved, not with maps or theories, but with wind-tattered sails and scarred skin, that the earth was round, that the oceans connected, that the world was larger and smaller than anyone imagined. Magellan did not live to see it. He did not touch the Spice Islands. He did not complete the circle. And yet it was his vision, his will, his path that carved the route. He became a symbol not of perfection, but of perseverance. For centuries, his name would be etched on maps, his strait a gateway to the Pacific, his voyage a monument to daring. He showed that glory lies not just in arrival, but in the relentless act of seeking. That even if you fall before the finish, the course you chart can still change the world. So now, brave dreamer, as your eyes begin to close and the stars outside your window rise like lanterns, imagine Magellan gripping the rail of his ship, staring into the black horizon. The sea all around him, endless, unknowable. The men behind him uncertain, the map before him unfinished. And yet he sails forward into waters no one has named, with only the stars as compass and the edge of belief as anchor. Good night, my celestial navigator. May your dreams sail through uncharted oceans, past fear, past doubt, and into the boundless blue of discovery. Abel Tasman, the silent cartographer of the South. In the windswept lowlands of the Netherlands, where gray skies hang heavy above tilled fields and water channels whisper stories of trade, a boy named Abel Tasman was born around the year 1603. He entered a world already leaning into the sea, a nation of merchants, navigators, and dreamers with sails stitched from both silk and ambition. The Dutch Republic, freshly independent and ferociously entrepreneurial, had begun to stretch itself across oceans in search of spices, wealth, and dominion. But Tasman was not born with wealth or a name soaked in glory. He came from simple stock, worked his way up the mast. His path was not gilded but earned, forged in salt and sweat. He joined the Dutch East India Company, VOC, the most powerful commercial enterprise the world had yet seen, a corporate colossus with armies, navies, and governors, all pledged to the pursuit of profit. By the early 17th century, the VOC had carved out a formidable empire in Asia. They controlled swaths of Indonesia, established trade routes from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan, and jealously guarded the secrets of spice. But they were also curious about what lay beyond the known edges of their maps. Rumors floated in sailors' tales of vast lands south of Java, of coastlines unseen, of a great southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, waiting to be revealed. Scholars believed it must exist. How else could the globe remain balanced? This mythical land had appeared in maps and imaginations for centuries, but no European had found it. And so, in 1642, Abel Tasman was given a mission. The VOC selected him to lead an expedition into the unexplored waters of the Southern Hemisphere. He was tasked not just with discovery, but with discretion. He was to chart, observe, and report, not to conquer yet. He sailed from Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, with 2 ships, the Heemskerk and the Zihin. They were sturdy vessels, manned by seasoned sailors and stocked with enough supplies to brave the unknown. Tasman's instructions were clear: sail south, then east, and find what had eluded others. What followed was a journey into mist and myth. First, he headed south into colder waters. The skies turned leaden. The waves grew wild. His ships creaked like old bones. But Tasman pushed on undeterred. In November 1642, land appeared on the horizon. A jagged, forested coastline cloaked in clouds and mist. Tasman named it Van Diemen's Land, after the governor of the Dutch East Indies. Today we call it Tasmania. He anchored cautiously, observing the terrain. The air was crisp, the land lush. Smoke rose in the distance, evidence of inhabitants, but Tasman made no contact. Whether out of caution, fear, or orders, he never stepped ashore. Instead, he sailed on eastward. A month later, his ships approached another massive coastline, mountainous and windswept. This was not the fabled southern continent. It was something else, an island nation the world would later name New Zealand. Here, Tasman's voyage took a darker turn. As his ships anchored in what is now Golden Bay, they were approached by Maori warriors, fierce, proud defenders of their land. Misunderstandings flared. In a sudden clash, several of Tasman's men were killed. The Dutch fired cannons in retaliation, then quickly retreated. Fearful of further confrontation, Tasman named the bay Murderers Bay and sailed north. He would never again attempt to land. He traced the western coast of New Zealand, sketched its curves, and added it to European maps for the first time. Then he sailed onward into the Pacific, discovering the islands of Tonga and Fiji, though again he made limited landfall. The journey had grown fraught, the crews weary, and fresh water dangerously low. In 1643, Tasman returned to Batavia. He had not found the great southern continent. He had not made grand alliances or claimed new lands for the Dutch. But he had done something quietly extraordinary. He had revealed enormous portions of the southern world, Tasmania, New Zealand, parts of Fiji, to European knowledge for the first time. And he had survived. For the VOC, obsessed with spices and profit, the expedition was a mild disappointment. There were no golden empires or sandalwood forests awaiting them on these new shores. Trade potential seemed minimal. They sent Tasman on one more voyage in 1644, this time along the northern coast of Australia. He mapped vast stretches of the continent's shoreline but never ventured far inland. Again, his reports were thorough but cautious, his tone professional, his ambition scientific. And then he faded into history's background. Unlike Columbus or Magellan, Tasman did not ignite wars, convert kings, or launch a global age. He was a surveyor, not a conqueror, a man who drew careful lines on fragile parchment, who moved quietly through waters where others shouted. He never saw his name etched in gold. He never knew that, centuries later, a wild and beautiful island would bear his name, or that countless travelers would cross the Tasman Sea between New Zealand and Australia, retracing his ghostly route. Tasman died in 1659, largely uncelebrated, living out his final years in relative obscurity. His journals gathered dust. His maps, folded and archived, waited quietly for the world to catch up. Only in retrospect did the magnitude of his discoveries fully register. He had not found fabled continents. He had found the real ones. And perhaps, dear dreamer, there's a lesson in that. Not all explorers blaze like comets. Some are quiet stars, constant, steady, unnoticed by crowds but essential in charting the sky. Tasman didn't seek glory. He sought clarity. And though he didn't conquer, he connected. Though he didn't plant flags, he planted knowledge. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture Abel Tasman standing at the helm of his ship, eyes narrowed against the salt wind, staring into a mist-shrouded bay. Picture his crew, nervous and exhausted, peering through spyglasses at lands untouched by Europe. Picture maps unfolding in candlelight, blank spaces slowly filled in with ink and wonder. Let your dreams be like his voyage, patient, deliberate, full of curiosity and care, because not all heroes are loud. Some, like Tasman, change the world by simply revealing it. Good night, my gentle cartographer. May your dreams be wide as oceans, silent as mist, and marked always by discovery. James Cook, the cartographer who rewrote the edges of the world. In the rural fields of Yorkshire, England, where the sky sprawled wider than imagination and the wind spoke in whistles through the moors, a farmer's son was born in 1728. His name was James Cook, and though no royal blood pulsed in his veins, he would one day stand among kings and explorers, not because of birthright, but because he dared to look where no one had looked before. Cook's story did not begin with a silver spoon or scholarly maps. He grew up working the land, helping his father tend fields. But something stirred in him, an itch for something more, something greater than tilled soil and English rain. At 17, he moved to a small coastal village and took an apprenticeship with a shipping firm. There, on the decks of coal-hauling ships, he learned the sea not as myth or metaphor, but as muscle and mathematics. He was not fast-tracked to greatness. Cook was methodical, studious. He taught himself geometry, astronomy, and cartography by candlelight in cramped quarters, poring over star charts and navigation manuals long after other men were asleep. His intelligence and discipline caught the attention of the Royal Navy, and during the 7 Years' War, he proved himself not only a skilled sailor, but a master mapmaker. In Canada, he mapped the treacherous St. Lawrence River so precisely that British warships used his charts to capture Quebec. In an age where maps were often little more than guesses, Cook's were instruments of near-scientific accuracy. The Admiralty took notice. Then came a commission that would change his life and redraw the globe. In 1768, the Royal Society, a collective of the greatest scientific minds of the time, requested a voyage to the South Pacific to observe the transit of Venus across the Sun. This rare astronomical event could help calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun, refining the scale of the entire solar system. But there was a second, secret mission embedded in the voyage, to search for the fabled Terra Australis Incognita, a massive southern continent theorized to balance the weight of the Earth's landmasses. Cook, then a lieutenant, was chosen to lead the expedition aboard the HMS Endeavour. It was not a grand warship, but a humble, sturdy bark, repurposed for science and exploration. His crew included sailors, botanists, artists, and astronomers. Among them was Joseph Banks, a wealthy young naturalist who would collect thousands of plant specimens, many unknown to Europe. Their journey took them first to Tahiti, where they successfully observed the Venus transit in June 1769. But Cook was not content with a celestial event. He turned the ship south, charting waters no European had crossed, moving ever closer to the great unknown. In October of that year, land appeared, green, rugged, wrapped in mist. They had reached New Zealand. Over the next 6 months, Cook circumnavigated both islands, correcting Abel Tasman's earlier assumptions that it was a part of a larger continent. He mapped the coastline with astonishing accuracy, interacted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes tensely, with the Maori people, and opened a new chapter in European understanding of the Pacific. But Cook was not done. He sailed westward, and in April 1770, his crew sighted a massive landmass, Australia. They landed at what Cook named Botany Bay, enchanted by the strange flora and fauna, kangaroos, giant flightless birds, trees that oozed red sap. Banks and his botanists collected samples in ecstasy. To Cook, this was a new world, untouched, vast, and mysterious. He claimed the eastern coast for Britain, naming it New South Wales. Then, on the voyage home, disaster struck. The Endeavour struck a coral reef on the Great Barrier Reef. For hours, water gushed into the hull. Men threw cannons overboard to lighten the load. By a miracle of skill and timing, they beached the ship for repairs and survived. It was a near-death encounter, but Cook pressed on. He returned to England a hero, not because he had planted flags or conquered peoples, but because he had brought back something more precious. Knowledge, detailed maps, accurate coordinates, new plants, animals, stars, and islands. He had transformed the world from speculation into substance. But his hunger for discovery remained. He embarked on 2 more voyages. On his second, he became the first European to cross the Antarctic Circle, sailing into freezing waters where icebergs loomed like mountains. Though he never sighted Antarctica itself, he proved that any southern continent was likely a frozen wasteland, not the lush paradise some had hoped. On his third voyage, Cook turned his attention north, seeking the elusive Northwest Passage, a maritime route through the Arctic that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific. He reached the coast of Alaska, braved the frigid Bering Sea, and explored the coasts of Siberia and the Aleutian Islands. But the ice was impenetrable. He retreated south, weary but undeterred, and found his way to the Hawaiian Islands, then unknown to Europe. At first, he was welcomed with reverence. The islanders believed he might be a deity, arriving in tandem with sacred festivals. He traded, observed, and recorded. But when Cook returned months later, after a failed northern passage, the mood had shifted. Tensions escalated. Misunderstandings sparked violence. In February 1779, on the island of Hawaii, Cook tried to take a local chief hostage after a stolen boat dispute. A scuffle broke out on the beach. Cook was struck, stabbed, and killed in the surf, his blood mingling with the ocean he had spent his life mapping. He was 50 years old. His death shocked the world, but his legacy was immediate and profound. Cook had charted more of the Earth's surface than any explorer before him. His maps were so precise that some would still be used well into the 20th century. His voyages connected cultures, expanded scientific understanding, and set the foundation for European colonization, both its glory and its grief. He was praised for his precision, admired for his discipline, but also criticized for the unintended consequences of his journeys. Where he landed, others followed. Traders, missionaries, soldiers, and with them came disease, empire, and upheaval for the peoples he had once studied with respect. James Cook was not a simple figure. He was not merely a navigator, nor just a symbol of empire. He was a man shaped by tides of science, ambition, and history. A man who measured the world not with swords, but sextants. A man who believed that to explore was to serve knowledge, even when it meant risking everything. So now, dear dreamer, as you drift into sleep and the constellations realign above your ceiling, imagine Cook standing at the bow of the Endeavour, a telescope in his hand, the Southern Cross gleaming. Behind him, the known world. Ahead, only sea. Let your dreams tonight stretch outward like the sails of his ship. Let them map the parts of your heart still unexplored. For every ocean hides a truth. Every coastline curves toward wonder. Good night, my fearless cartographer. May your sleep be a voyage, your thoughts charted in stars, and your questions as endless as the sea. The mapmakers of dreams, a final voyage through time. And now, dear dreamer, as we near the edge of night, with stars blinking above like distant beacons, let us pause and reflect. We've traveled across centuries and continents, followed footsteps through jungles, deserts, and ice fields. We've crossed oceans on cracked wooden decks and flown on sails kissed by storm winds. We've whispered the names of adventurers who once stood alone on the edge of the world and dared to ask what lies beyond. But before sleep fully claims you, let us gather these figures, not as statues or myths, but as people, flawed and brilliant, bold and broken. There was Columbus, who sailed west in search of the East and found a land already home to millions. His name echoes through time, both praised and protested. He opened a door and could not control what poured through it. There was Vespucci, who read the stars and dared to say, this is something new. Though he never set out to etch his name into maps, the world would take his letters and grant him a continent. There was Da Gama, whose voyage stitched Europe to India across a tapestry of warships and wind. He brought back spices, but also storms of empire. And then Magellan, who didn't live to see the circle completed but dreamed it into existence. The sea claimed him, yet the journey endured, wrapping the globe in truth. Tasman, quiet and cautious, added pieces to the puzzle with careful lines and little fanfare. His gift was not conquest but curiosity, not claim but clarity. And Cook, oh Cook, who wrapped the world in precision. A man of measurement and marvel who turned blank corners of the earth into stories, plants, stars, and coastlines that could be followed. Each of these explorers changed the way humans saw the planet, but they did not do so alone. For every name we remember, there were hundreds more pilots and translators, navigators and naturalists, enslaved people and indigenous guides, anonymous heroes whose hands steered rudders, prepared meals, patched sails, and carried the weight of history without ever having their names written on parchment. There were the Taino people who met Columbus with gifts, not knowing what would follow. The Malay pilot who steered Da Gama across the Indian Ocean. The Maori warriors who defended their land from Tasman's ships. The Hawaiians who watched Cook arrive like a god and die like a man. These voices, once whispered or silenced, now rise in chorus, completing the story that history once told in fragments. Because exploration is not just a tale of adventure. It is a tale of encounter. Where world meets world, stories are exchanged, but so are wounds. Knowledge spreads, but so do consequences. Spices may flavor meals, but the hands that gathered them were often chained. Empires rise from maps drawn in candlelight, but so do borders, broken promises, and scars. And yet, here we are, still drawn to the stars, still asking what lies beyond the horizon. Why? Because something inside us is restless. Something in the human heart longs to know. We look at the ocean and feel small, yes, but also called. We stand on cliffs and wonder what lies on the other side, not just of water, but of understanding. That's why we remember these explorers, not just for where they went, but for what they reveal about us. Our brilliance, our blindness, our reach, our reckoning. And so now you too become a kind of explorer. When you dream, you map your own universe. You travel not by ship, but by thought. You seek not continents, but courage. You ask questions, what if? Why not? What's next? And those questions are sails of their own. So, dear traveler of the mind, as your breath slows and the room around you fades into starlight, picture the world as it once was, mysterious, unmeasured, vast. Picture a ship creaking in the night, sails puffed with wind, lanterns swinging. Picture a hand tracing ink over parchment, sketching coastlines never seen. Picture a compass trembling on a wooden table. A heartbeat in the dark. That heartbeat is yours. The sea still whispers. The stars still guide, and the world, though charted, is still full of wonder. Because exploration was never just about places. It was and always will be about possibilities. Good night, my mapmaker of dreams. May you wake with questions, may you sail with kindness, and may your journey, wherever it leads, always begin with wonder.